I notice quite a lot of empty seats out there. I don't know if this indicates that everybody has given up on democracy or that democracy is so well entrenched it's not even worth talking about. I always think as a moderator, one should be neutral. But if that's not possible, then one should at least explain or assert one's biases. And I have to say I'm rather partial to the forms of democracy that have been established in this part of the world over the last several decades, partly because I've spent a lot of my life reporting on it, including right here in South Korea. I am a fully paid up member of what we used to call the Yonsei Beach Club. And the Yonsei Beach Club is a group of reporters, cameramen, TV guys, and we used to camp outside the gates of Yonsei University on the railway embankment, sunning ourselves, waiting for the students to sort of gird up for a rumble with the police, with their Molotov cocktails and gas masks and so on and so forth. I lived in Taiwan in the 1980s, and when I went there, Taiwan was under martial law, and when I left, it was embarked upon its a democratization process, and I was there when President Jiang Jingguo's hearse drove through the streets of Taipei, bequeathing democracy to the nation. He will go down in history, I have no doubt, as one of the great Chinese leaders of all time. I followed People's Power revolution in the Philippines, I reported in Indonesia, and so on and so forth. It's a huge topic, lots to talk about. We have an all-star lineup. Let me just go through our guests. To my left, Professor Daniel Bell, Director of the Center for International and Comparative Political Theory, and Professor of Ethics and Political Philosophy at Tsinghua University. He's taught in Singapore and Hong Kong and has held research fellowships at Princeton and Stanford. In between all this, he has authored or co-edited 15 books, including 7 with Princeton University Press. He was educated at McGill and Oxford. Dr. Edwin Feulner is a Chong Ju-yong Fellow and Chairman of the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation, a founding trustee of the Heritage Foundation and served as its president from 1977 to 2013. He's just told me that's 37 years. Amazing record. He was named one of the 7 most powerful conservatives in Washington by Forbes magazine. The Daily Telegraph in London proclaimed him to be one of the 100 most influential American conservatives. And was included in a Washingtonian list of 45 who shaped Washington. To his left is Dr. Eric Lee, founder and managing director of Chengwei Capital and a senior fellow at the Chunqiu Institute, the Henry Crown Fellow at the Aspen Institute. He serves on the board of directors of China-Europe International Business School, CEIBS, in Shanghai, and the board of trustees of the Berkeley Art Museum, Pacific Film Archive, University of California. He is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, Financial Times, Christian Science Monitor, South China Morning Post. I don't see my own newspaper in here. What happened, Eric? We'll have to fix that. And the Huffington Post. Received his BA from the University of California in the US, and an MBA from Stanford Business School. Daniel, can we start with you? Out of all your 15 books, perhaps you could distill some of the wisdom that I know you have in the way you think about democracy and the moral and ethical aspects of democracy.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I guess thank you also. We're beginning with a moderate voice, yeah? Okay. I mean, I've been teaching at Tsinghua University in Beijing for 10 years, and I confess that the longer I've been there, the more I'm developing a charitable view of the Chinese political system. Let me explain why that is, but then of course I'm going to also describe some problems and how perhaps they can be improved. I mean, I think, you know, that everybody agrees that democracy is a good thing, right? Nobody wants to be ruled by political leaders who are totally unaccountable. We all want some sort of say in choosing our political leaders. I mean, it'd be irrational not to be a Democrat. But I think we also want leaders who have superior ability and virtue. I mean, it would be irrational to not want a leader who's smart enough to know how to achieve the purposes that we care about. And also, I think it would be irrational not to want a leader who is virtuous, at least in the sense of not being corrupt. I mean, we want a leader who is willing to pursue the common good as opposed to their own private interest. So in this sense, I think we're all meritocrats, that we're both Democrats and meritocrats. I mean, I don't think it's very controversial to assert those claims, but the problem is how to reconcile those two. I mean, how can we, what is a kind of political regime that could be both democratic and meritocratic? And I think this is the big challenge for political thinkers. Many thinkers in the 19th century, such as John Stuart Mill, really worked on those issues, but in the post-World War II era, the kind of meritocratic aspect has been completely downplayed, at least in Western political discourse. So let me just briefly lay out some models of how to reconcile democracy and meritocracy. I mean, one way is just, the answer for Democrats is just leave it up to the voters to choose leaders who have superior ability and virtue. But there's tons of social science research, I'm not going to go through it now, that shows that voters, including in so-called advanced developed countries, are systematically irrational when it comes to making economic decisions, for example. And also that when they're not irrational, they tend to be focused on their narrow economic interests as opposed to voting in accordance with the common good, which is really problematic because when you vote, you're voting for somebody whose decisions affect not just yourself, but affect others. It's not like going to a movie, where you decide to go which movie is good, which one is bad. It only affects yourself. When you vote, it affects other people. So you should take into account the interests of other people. But most people don't do that. Even when voting works well, when people vote in accordance with the common good, meeting the good of the voting community, the problem now is that the political leaders, especially in big countries like China and US, their policies affect not just the voting community, but they affect people who don't have the vote, future generations, and people living outside the state. On issues like global warming, which, as you know, is now the big issue, perhaps, when there's a conflict of interest between the community of voters and the community of non-voters, the community of voters tends to have priority. So this is a big problem. So how could we implement a kind of meritocratic check on the excesses of democracy? So there have been various models to do that. Sun Yat-sen had a model. Today in China, people are developing ideas, for example, where you have a kind of horizontal models, where one house is democratically chosen, one house of government at the top is democratically chosen, let's say one person, one vote, and another one is more meritocratically chosen, where you'd have, for example, examinations to choose leaders. And you have Confucian thinkers like Jiang Qing, who have been arguing along those lines, and I confess I've been arguing along those lines also, but I've now come to think that those views are not really promising. For one thing, they're not really realistic in a Chinese context, and more worryingly, that they're not really, if you implement that sort of constitution, like you imagine where you have one house of government which is democratic and one which is meritocratic, inevitably the democratic house will have more and more power compared to the meritocratic house. And if you think of the UK, the House of Lords, or in Canada, the Senate, inevitably the democratic house tends to have more and more power. And it's very hard for the meritocratic house to have some sort of say when there's a serious conflict of interest, including in China. I think that's bound to happen. There's a whole set of reasons why, but once one person, one vote is implemented, no matter what the political culture, what the political context, it tends to be viewed as an almost sacred value that you can't question and as the only source of legitimacy in a system. So when my Confucian friends say that, well, we can have that and meritocracy, Jiang Qing is often criticized for being too anti-democratic because he's saying, well, let's not just have democracy. But I think he's actually too democratic because once you have this house of democracy, it's bound to overpower the other houses. So what's another model? Well, here we can call it vertical democratic meritocracy. And here we have, for example, democracy at local level. And it's not just in China, but many Western political theorists argue that democracy works best at the local level because there the issues are easier to understand. The people know the moral character of the leaders that they're voting for. It's easier to develop a sense of community at a local level. And if you make mistakes, it's not the end of the world. Whether to build a road here or a road there, it's not the end of the world, right? But at the higher levels of government, for example, in a country of 1.3 billion people, if mistakes are made, it's a huge problem. And the issues are very, very complex. You want leaders who are much more intelligent, as well as more forward-looking compared to the local level, where it doesn't matter as much. So arguably, a good model of reconciling democracy and meritocracy is you have democracy at the local level, but the further up you go the chain of political command, the more meritocratic the system becomes. So for example, there's more emphasis on examinations to choose leaders, on having experience when it comes to choosing leaders. And when you think of it, that's more or less the model of political reform that has inspired change in China over the past 20 or 30 years. So that's the sense in which I'm becoming more sympathetic to the Chinese political model. But I think there are three issues, three big problems with vertical democratic meritocracy. Now let me just describe those and then I'll end. The first problem is what's known as guarding the guardians. I mean, if the voters don't choose the leaders at the top, how could they be held accountable? And the big issue is, for example, corruption, right? I mean, if it's a democratic country and the leaders are corrupt, well, then you just vote them out of power, and that's it. But in a meritocracy, you can't do that. Now, I agree with Eric, my friend, that actually China, compared to other countries at similar levels of economic development, is not that corrupt. But it's actually a bigger problem in China than in democratic countries, not just because you can't vote out of power political leaders, but also because it really goes right to the heart of the legitimacy of the system. Because in a democratic system, the leaders get their legitimacy by virtue of being chosen by the people, by virtue of consent. But in a meritocracy, an important source of legitimacy is that they have superior ability and virtue. And virtue really just means that they're committed to the common good. If their leaders are corrupt, I mean, by definition, it means that they're abusing the common good for their own private interests. It's going to affect the legitimacy of the system. So that's why the Chinese leaders go on and on about how corruption is really a stake in the heart of the political system. There's very strong motivation in a meritocracy to challenge corruption in a way that's not true in a democracy. The good news, and here I think maybe I'll side with my friend Eric, I think is that there's reasons to be optimistic that China, precisely because corruption is such a problem for the Chinese political system, it really undermines the legitimacy of the system in a way which is not true in a democracy. There's very strong incentive to deal with corruption, and I actually think that China's going to do better than democratic countries at a similar level of economic development at dealing with corruption, let's say a decade from now. And the anti-corruption campaign, for the first time, I mean, it's really systematic. If anything, it's like going too far. Whenever you travel in China now to local governments, they kind of say, geez, we can't do it. We can't even have drink anymore. And people say that it's becoming too kind of obsessive, this anti-corruption campaign. Whatever, it's certainly becoming, I think it's relatively effective, and it's not just designed at attacking political leaders as it was in the past. The second problem with a kind of vertical model of democratic meritocracy is what we can call the ossification of the political system. That when there's an idea of merit, it becomes ossified, and what works in one time no longer works in the future. And there's a need to have a system which is sufficiently adaptable so that new notions of merit come into play and that political leaders are appointed according to these new notions of merit. I think the Chinese political system is quite adaptable in that sense. In the past, it was more economic performance that determined whether leaders were viewed as able. Now it's much more, it's coming, more, the criteria becoming wider, for example, environmental sustainability. But still, there's a need, I think, for a more open systems so that new leaders with new forms of merit can be identified. And for that, you really need freedom of speech, I think more so than you have in China now. Because, I mean, John Stuart Mill's famous argument again about for freedom of speech, there were two, right? One is that you needed to correct mistaken policies. I think Confucians have long argued along those lines as well. But Mill, he also made a very interesting argument that you need freedom of speech to identify who the future moral and political leaders are going to be in society. Because at one point of time, they might be viewed as non-mainstream and problematic, but they might point the way to the future. And you need the freedom of speech for those leaders to be identified. So I think to kind of, so that the system won't be so ossified, I think there's a need for more freedom of political speech so that new sources of merit can be identified in the system. The third problem, the last one, is this issue of legitimacy. And I agree, again, with Eric and many other friends that democracy is not the only source of legitimacy in a political system. In China, you have, for example, nationalism can be a source of legitimacy, Good performance can be a source of legitimacy. I already mentioned meritocracy is also a source of legitimacy. But at some point, especially when the economy becomes more developed, there's going to be more of a need to have a more open political system so that there's a greater role placed on some sort of consent to the political system. Because I've been working on this issue of political meritocracy now for a few years, and I find, the best way of identifying critics of the system is to speak to those who failed on the examinations to be public servants. And so how could the system be made more legitimate to those who are really outside the system? I think this is a big issue, and I think we have to do it without multi-party elections, because that's going to undermine the really meritocratic aspect at the top. I mean, the main benefits are that you can have this long-term perspective, you can have decades-long training, which a democratic system at the top doesn't really allow. So how can you have a greater role for consent? I think this is a big problem, and I'm going to predict that in maybe 15 or 20 years, there's going to be a need for a referendum in China. Ask the people, do you endorse a system of vertical democratic meritocracy? I think you can get a large majority of people voting yes. It's a good model, and once there's that sort of explicit endorsement for the system, let's say 50 years time frame, I think it'll make the system more stable, and they won't have to rely on political oppression so much to deal with those who oppose the system. All in here.
If I could just ask one simple question before if it's okay to ask the population to vote on what political system they would prefer, why not ask them to vote on what leaders they would prefer?
What I have in mind here is a referendum which is like held once every 50 years. Where I'm from Quebec, where we also have referendum. Referendum is different than a democratic election. Democratic election, you have all the voter irrationality come into play. But a referendum, you can have a prolonged period of deliberations, and so when people vote in those really big constitutional issues, once in a lifetime or once in 50 years, the people tend to be more informed than if they vote in periodic elections. And I already mentioned periodic elections. The big problem once you have that is that it undermines the benefits of having a meritocratic system. I mean, a meritocratic system is you want leaders who have long-term horizons, who aren't worried about being subject to being thrown out of power every few years. And you also want a system which has decades-long training. You also want a system which allows for experimentation. I mean, one of the great virtues of the Chinese system is that you can have experimentation below the level of central government. If it works, then you could generalize it to the whole country. You can't have that in a democratic system, because if there's different change in party, the experiment that works in one place, the next political party might not want to generalize it. So in other words, I think there's good reasons to prefer not to have periodic elections at the top.
Dr. Feulner, a huge amount of food for thought there. I was going to ask you, actually, if there was an examination for American politicians, how many do you think would get the passing grade? But I won't. So according to my briefing notes, a century ago, I'll ask you a broader question. A century ago, there were no democracies in the world. Now there are 118. But as we saw from the film that launched our forum here, there are many challenges, including to democracy as it exists right now in the United States. And I'm just wondering if you could address that theme and tell us what your view is of democracy, the democratic system around the world, and particularly in the United States.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. My first question to Daniel, I guess, would be if it's all right to have that vote 50 years from now, why we couldn't do it now in China. But we can get into that perhaps a little bit later on. Looking back at the basic theme and your point about the video that started us off the last two mornings, looking particularly at those vignettes from the Arab Spring and the great hope that was rising up among the people for the opportunity to participate in a genuinely democratic form of government, that in the information age in which we live, the opportunity of so many people to see what other options might be out there and to be able to participate in that was a very hopeful sign. Part of the result, of course, was we had in some places one man, one vote, one time. And that's not the way democracy is supposed to work. Part of the problem from that, I guess, is that in any political system, no matter what we all think when we reach down and see our little machines here, there is no instant gratification in the political arena. You're not immediately going to be happy, and if you're not immediately happy with the democratic process, nasty things can result from that, eventually leading perhaps to the end of the democratic process, a military takeover or whatever, something that's less desirable politically for everyone. At the same time, for the individual going into a local cafe in rural Korea or even in rural parts of China, looking at the internet and seeing what others have, whether what they have is more widgets or more dollars or more leisure or more education or more whatever it is they want. The question obviously is, if they've got it, why can't I get it? And that's, I guess, one of the reasons why the democratic processes basically evolve. What I would make the case that the future democracy fundamentally depends on 4 basic criteria, which I think need, in some cases, to be articulated more effectively, in other cases to be implemented more efficiently. One is an expansion of space for the individual. I'm very pleased to see that one of the Asan Institute's translations is of Friedrich Hayek's, one of Friedrich Hayek's primary works. You can buy it, I think, for 12,000 won in Korean, or you can buy it for $18 in English or whatever. But Hayek made the argument that it is very, very important not to have centralized controls coming down that limit an individual's space, in effect. The second one that is of concern to all of us who look at whatever the government structure is the rule of law. Is an individual going to be treated the same under the law, whether he is, as the phrase goes, a prince or a pauper? And this is not something to be passed over lightly. It's incredibly important to what the political evolution of a system is. The third criteria that I'll put forward is alternative private institutions, that government doesn't have a monopoly on the institutions, whether those institutions are religious, charitable, knowledge-oriented, that, again, there is more space, there is more choice. In the words of the phrase of Milton Friedman's last book, you're free to choose, that there are options out there. And the fourth is something that I guess is easier nowadays, that everyone in this room participates in to a greater or lesser extent, and that is increased transparency. And the transparency not only for individuals, but transparency on the part of government. In the United States, various experiments are ongoing where state or local budgets are in their entirety printed on the web. If you want to go on the internet and look at the budget of the city of Chicago, you probably won't get many details, but if you go on and you look at other localities in different states or other state governments, you will get a lot of detail, and you'll be able to say, hey, is that really the best way that we're spending taxpayer money? I hope we will get into some good give and take. I look forward to it with Daniel in terms of the meritocracy type of argument. I happen to think that the founding fathers of the United States basically got it right when they came up with the division of power among the different institutions, whether it's a House of Representatives broadly reflective of the population, or whether it's the United States Senate, where you have 2 members per state, whether it's the federal system where you have the states basically doing as much as possible at that level. And here I think we would broadly be in agreement. The closer government is to the people, the better it tends to be, because the people can hold it more accountable. And can't blame it on a distant bureaucracy, whether the distant bureaucracy is in Beijing, in Seoul, or back in Washington, D.C., if you're living somewhere else. So with those 4 fundamental criteria, I think there is a very bright future for democracy. I frankly hope that it will be, in more conventional terms, expanding elsewhere around the world as we look ahead and as future generations will have the opportunity to enjoy its many blessings. I could go into other details about either some positive examples or some somewhat depressing ones. Prime Minister Erdogan, I've had the opportunity to be in Turkey several times in the last several years, been very impressed with the economic progress, with the political progress being made in Turkey. Then hearing some of Erdogan's comments when they just had the local elections about anyone who opposed him will have to flee to their caves, but we will hunt them out the day after the election. This is not a very encouraging sign if you're an opposition politician or an independent journalist in a place that we all hope will be moving closer toward democracy. So again, we can see good examples, we can see bad examples around the world, but as Churchill once pointed out, democracy is the worst form of government except all the others. Thank you.
That's a good place to stop. In China, we have a regime that exists on campuses called the 7 No's, 7 不, 7 things you're not supposed to talk about. And I'm sorry to say, Dr. Feulner, that almost everything you've spoken about would be encompassed by those 7 不. I'm not even sure that the founding fathers would get much of a hearing.
That's not enforced rigorous. I teach democratic theory. I just did it last night at Chengwei University. I mean, yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, Dr. Lee, Eric, is one of the most articulate and certainly sophisticated defenders of the political system as it exists in China. You're quoted as saying in an article you wrote for Foreign Affairs magazine, which I just read, you talked about a post-democratic future. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what you mean by that.
Well, thank you. I'm not a defender of anything, and I'm not an advocate of anything. I'm just a student of political systems. So I like to analyze things instead of sort of advocate something or defend something. But I think it's useful. Let me suggest that we first define what we're talking about. So I think we should have a definition of democracy that we could work off of. And let me suggest something for consideration. I think democracy in today's world, at least, means universal suffrage, one person, one vote, plus periodical multi-party elections. Party compete to get into power, plus possibly referendums. That's a fair description of democracy, how democracy is defined today. If you don't have these things, I think people won't call you a democracy. Okay? So let me say that I think that model of governance is in deep trouble, and its future is dismal. It's in the worst crisis in probably 100 years. And I think it's useful first to take a historical perspective. Democracy as we know it, as we just defined it, I think takes its lineage from representative institutions that began in England 400 or 500 years ago, or 200 or 300 years ago, depending on how you interpret history. Yeah? And it evolved to today. So if you accept that, I think most political scientists would accept that, then democracy as we know it is an accident. That model of governance we just described, universal suffrage, multi-party elections, referendums, is an accident. Because those who pioneered and built representative institutions, including the founding fathers of the United States, those who designed it, were extraordinarily hostile to political power of the people. They would have hated universal suffrage. In fact, they opposed it with everything they got, number one. And they hated the idea of political parties. That was a fact. In America, in France and Germany, outlawed political parties until recently, like 100 years ago or something. And of course, I think it was Madison finally reluctantly formed a political party. He hated the idea, he had to do it. Okay, so they hated universal suffrage, and they hated political parties. And referendum, my God, they turn over in their graves. So I think democracy is I'm not making any judgment on it. I'm just saying, factually, it's an accident of historical development. It was not intended that way, number one. Number two, democracy as we know it is a contradiction. Okay, and that contradiction, of course, every American high school student is taught that contradiction. Democracy, of course, took its roots in the liberal outlook, liberté, égalité, fraternité, or life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all men are created equal. Now, these concepts are inherently contradictory to each other. For instance, the most basic one, of course, is liberty and equality. They are fundamentally a contradiction. We talked about rule of law, for instance. Everyone is treated equal before the law. Of course, that's about liberty. You're free. But are you free is it fair or is it equal if I have more money, I hire a better lawyer, and you're poor, you don't have access to a better lawyer, and I win the case? How do you resolve that conflict? Or do you want to level the playing field and have a welfare state? Nobody could hire their own private lawyer, Obamacare, for the law. Okay, just a couple of examples. Okay, freedom of speech, liberty. I can say anything I want. But does that mean that if I have money, I can buy all the advertising on television, all the commercials on television to support one policy or one candidate? The Supreme Court of the United States just said you could. For decades, they said you could not. But last week, they just said, yes, you could. And of course, a lot of people in America think it's a horrible idea. It's completely against the idea of equality. But then, of course, the concept of liberty will say that it's my money, why can't I spend it this way I see fit to express my speech? So these concepts are fundamentally opposed to each other, and these are irreconcilable differences, irreconcilable. And so is it possible? Is it possible? Don't hold me to it. Is it possible? The success of the West, of the modern West in the last 200 years, was achieved not because of democracy, but despite of it. Just, is it possible that we're at a point where these conflicts are truly irreconcilable? Before, for a long time, those conflicts might have been paid or covered up or being able to, the system grew out of it because of, for instance, in the case of Great Britain, of course, colonization externalized a lot of the conflicts. Prisoners to the nasty, send them to Australia, right? Import resources, or is it possible? So is that possible that we're at a point, if you go to America, they can't resolve the question of the role of government? It's an irreconcilable conflict. You can argue and kill each other, and you still won't agree on it, the role of government. And they will be debating that for the next 30 years, I guaranteed. Okay, so democracy is a contradiction. Third, democracy as we know it has become highly dysfunctional. If you examine all the entire developed world, from America to Europe, highly dysfunctional, partisan, they can't agree on anything. It turns out, it's very, very funny, when I was going to school, the political scientists of my time were telling me one of the great attributes of democracy is it's flexible, self-correction, FDR, self-corrected, save capitalism, blah, blah, blah. But it turns out, today's democracy is highly rigid. It cannot change. What's his name? Fareed Zakaria, the political scientist in America, said last year at some point when he was frustrated, maybe he didn't mean it, but he said, America really should adopt a parliamentary system. This presidential system sucked. It couldn't work. We need a parliamentary system. But is that possible? Of course, it's not possible. Every political scientist worth his stripes will tell you that today it's virtually impossible to amend the US Constitution. Not possible. Impossible barriers to cross. So even within different types of democratic models, you cannot move from one to the other. You can't make Britain a presidential system. Not possible. So or vice versa. So even within different types of democratic models, it's so rigid as to not be able to make that change. Okay? It's an imperfect comparison, I take it, but I was talking about the 18th Party Congress in China, right? The highest ruling body, the standing committee of the Communist Party Politburo, used to have 9 members. For 10 years, they had 9 members. It turned out to be a bad idea. Everybody knew, inefficient, powers diffused. And then at the 18th Party Congress, they took it down to 7, like that. Can you imagine taking the US Senate from 100 to 88? Is that possible? Not possible. Even if you need to do it, not possible. Okay, and then we're in a situation where the political scientist Dr. Olson, in his great book called Rise and Fall of Nations, incredible book, talked about the concept of distributive coalitions. So democracy is advanced to a certain degree where distributive coalitions are choking it to death. They can't agree on anything. They're just looking after themselves. Frank Fukuyama called it vetocracy. So not democracy, but vetocracy. So nothing can get done. Okay. So you have all these issues. I mean, last week, Princeton University, two really good professors. I just read the whole thing from beginning to the end. It's actually a book. I read it on the plane this morning. I got up too early and enough coffee. Professor Gillens and Professor Page from Princeton University. It's incredible. It's called Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens. It's a really, really good study. At first, I thought this was some liberal crap, okay? And I read it. I was so surprised by how scholarly it was conducted. They researched, this is, I think, the first work of this kind. They researched American public policy since 1971, or 1971 to 2000 something. And they did a full range study. And they segregated the American public from income level 90th percentile, 95th percentile, and 5th percentile. And turned out, based on public opinion surveys, the 90th percentile or above held totally opposite views of public policies as opposed to the 50th percentile. And almost 99% of the public policies that got enacted in those 30 or 40 years, guess who won? The 95th percentile. So this study, actually, in their summary, basically says America is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy. It is, in fact, an oligarchy. That the views of the average citizens are, in fact, irrelevant for decade after decade. And it's a really good study. You should really study. I mean, this is the first time I've seen a lot of data. Okay, so it's in trouble. It's in trouble in the developed world. Okay, and I think democracy is in even deeper trouble in the developing world. After the Cold War, Freedom House had this number. I read it all the time. The number of countries that adopted electoral democracy, the one we defined, had skyrocketed. You know, from 47 to like 140 or something. Everybody bought it. Okay, and let's take a survey of these 100 or so countries. Okay, from Middle East to Africa to Southeast Asia, everybody's still corrupt as hell. Those who are fighting civil wars are fighting worse civil wars. Those who are poor got poorer. Now, there are a couple of examples, a couple of exceptions. Okay, a heck of a lot more failure stories than success stories. A few cases that are being billed as success stories. Korea is one. And I don't know enough about Korea, so I don't want to comment on it. I mean, I think you got a lot of challenges too. But the other was, I think it was an absolute joke. The moderator first raised it. Taiwan. It's an absolute joke. I mean, I went to Taiwan for the first time in 1993. This is something I do know something about. I've been back to Taiwan once a year for the last 20 years. Okay, I lecture at Taiwan University, okay? Now, in 1993, when I first went to Taiwan, I loved the place. It was so beautiful, so gentle, so Chinese. You know, in mainland China, where I came from, we destroyed so much of our own culture because of the stupid revolutions. I love the place. The last 10 years, the place has been a disaster since they started electing their presidents. Disaster, okay? Taipei has not changed for 10 years. Infrastructure is in terrible disrepair. Total underinvestment in health and education, okay? Everything, the middle income has been dropping for 10 years straight. Middle class people have nothing to look forward to. Let me give you one number to show you. Taiwan has 23 million people, total population. A full 1.3 million are now living and working on the mainland. 1.3 million, okay, what's the number? That's 7–8% of the population. If you take away the old people and the young people, 15% of adults of Taiwan are living and working on the mainland. Now, all those people, almost all of them, are highly educated people with college degrees. So if you take away the taxi drivers, the dishwashers, and the maids, half of the educated elites have moved to the mainland. If you take away those who moved to North America and Europe, the educated elites are left on the island are either politicians or Mingzui guys like us, talking on television. Okay? There's no one else left. No wonder the entire high-tech miracle is over in Taiwan. Have you heard of, I mean, when I was growing up, when I was going into business, Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation, those were the dream companies. All gone. Never heard of another Taiwanese company anymore, and you're not going to hear another one for the next 20 years, I guarantee you, under this political system. Ain't going to happen. Okay, so I rest my case.
That's such a demolition job on Taiwan. I almost feel like I should leap to its defense, but I hope there's some Taiwanese in the audience who'll do that for me. By the way, one can breathe the air over there, which is something to be said. Let me, where do we go from here? Professor Bell, Daniel, you were going to correct me on the Chibu. The 7 no's, and describe democracy as it is practiced on campuses in China?
Oh, well, I mean, you know, that these, you know, orders, if that's what we want to call them, when they filter down to the university, they tend not to be enforced in any serious way. I mean, I've been teaching in China for 10 years, and I teach political theory, including, you know, very sensitive material. Just last night I gave a seminar on, well, it wasn't a seminar, it's addressing undergraduates on John Stuart Mill's idea of representative government. No, the only constraint I've ever faced in 10 years teaching in China was I was told not to teach Marxism because my interpretation might differ from the official interpretation. Other than that, of course, when it comes to publication, in English they don't care, you know. In Chinese, then there is censorship. But again, if you put it on the internet, as you probably know, I mean, every publisher has a kind of party guy who has to sign off and take responsibility. And often some of them are more cautious than others, so you can move from one publisher to another. But on the internet, it's much more free. There's hardly anybody there enforcing it, at least compared to the public. What's published in hard copy, so to speak. So I just mean that, you know, I know it's not you know, it's not something that is taken seriously even by those of us who teach in very sensitive areas.
And yet, if one takes just one of the components of a democracy, as it was laid out for us, transparency. You have examples now in China of people who are being put in jail for advocating a very moderate form of transparency. Xu Zhong, and what did he want? He wanted basically government officials to declare their assets, a rather reasonable request, one would have to say.
Well, let Eric comment on that.
I think it's a trick to get into a specific case. I've never met Xu Zhong. I haven't read his case report. You could put up a propaganda case. Xu Zhong. I mean, I don't know enough. I think he broke the law. There is a anti-subversion law that you cannot organize. Let me come back to another interesting concept I'd like to touch on about liberty again. This is an idea I really like, freedom. And of course, Isaiah Berlin said that there are 2 kinds of freedoms: negative freedom and positive freedom. And negative liberty is the freedom from something, that I could do what I want, don't interfere. Positive freedom is freedom to do something, to effect, to organize a political party, to give speech, to publish, okay? And I would argue that most people care about negative freedom. Those few who are really passionate about reforming society and making society in their own, in the idealist utopia, they want positive freedom. They want the freedom to form political parties and do these things. So I think, yes, in China, positive freedom is greatly curtailed. But negative freedom, the freedom to do what you want while you're not in the public square, but in your own space, I think it's greater than the United States. Let me give you a few examples. In America, you cannot even open a restaurant without building a ramp for wheelchairs. ADA. It's an enormous invasion of negative freedom. Okay, so I would argue, to some extent, in some respect, I mean, I'm not making a total case here, in some respect, you could argue that in China, actually, negative freedom, the range of negative freedom the individual could enjoy is wider than many Western democracies. Now, in positive freedom, it's much, much more strict, much, much narrower.
Let me come back on a couple specifics. First of all, I suspect you and I are both members of the same men's club in San Francisco.
Yes.
And but the Tea Party, for example, being denied the right to organize itself at the local level, et cetera, because of Internal Revenue Service regulations in the United States. Some of these restrictions of political organization that bother me probably wouldn't bother you, but at the same time, I would support, I did support, the Supreme Court's decision in terms of removing restrictions on how much people can give, because right now, if you want to write for Huffington Post and I want to write for the Heritage Foundation Foundry, we have our own outlets.
Right.
We aren't being constrained on one side by Charles and David Koch, or on another side by liberals from buying up all the TV commercials.
Right.
So, you know, some of your allegations, I guess, are just a little bit over the top when you're criticizing where we are and where we're trying to go. I don't make the case that democracy in the United States is perfect, but I will say that there's a great deal more participation in both negative and positive freedom, I think, in the United States than there is in the PRC.
I mean, I told you I would come off as a moderate on this panel. In terms of you know, this negative and positive liberty, I mean, I think that, you know, to preserve the meritocratic aspect, we need to come clean and say that there needs to be limits on the freedom of association to form political parties. But beyond that, I think it's you know, China, as you know, has become much more complex and with different interest groups and so on. And there's going to be a need for, I think, much more openness in terms of freedom of association and freedom to form NGOs. I mean, it's moving in that direction, but I think it's bound to become more open in that respect. But we need to come clean and say, except for the freedom to form political parties. But the rest, I don't think we need to justify, you know, I mean, at least that's my view. So in other words, I think there's a good case to be made for a more open society as China develops, but, and maybe this is where the founding fathers, including John Stuart Mill, who was against political parties, but they didn't make it so explicit that if you're against political parties, you need to just, you know, enshrine it in the Constitution, this limit on forming political parties and make the penalties clear, you know, and I think that would be a much better way of proceeding than a kind of somewhat arbitrary way of drawing the lines and, you know, and imprisoning people for this or that. We don't really know how things are decided, and it seems kind of arbitrary. Yeah.
In fact, in France and Germany, a lot of the European democracies, they did outlaw political parties for a very, very long time.
If I could just come back on one of your points, Eric, the point about big government in America, stifling companies, stifling innovation, all the sort of the red tape. It so happens that I spent an hour with Premier Li Keqiang last week. And he spent much of that time talking about his mission, which was to dismantle approval systems and structures in China to allow businesses to flourish. And his main argument, or one of his main arguments, was that the approval system that you have in place now encourages corruption and rent-seeking behavior. And indeed, that's one of the big planks of the Communist Party and of the reforms that are being spearheaded by President Xi Jinping. On the issue of corruption, you say there's corruption as bad as hell in all sorts of places around the world. Isn't this now one of the defining characteristics of the Chinese political system?
Corruption is a big problem for Chinese system at the moment, and I think it's and I think it traces back in history for a very, very long time. It has unique historical and cultural roots, and there's probably no easy solution to it. You could try to contain it, but you can never eliminate it, I don't think. But I do want to make one point that I think to link corruption, the level of corruption, to the nature of the political system, I think it's just a really weak case.
But you did that earlier in your
Yeah, I gave that. I mean, if you look at all the data, Transparency International, for instance, that's the one I used. I don't really, I mean, I don't actually buy the data, but that's the data everybody accepts, so I use it, okay? I mean, you know, China's ranked, what is it, 70-something, okay? It's been moving up, it's moving up from 80-something to 70-something. India, the greatest democracy, is 95 and dropping, okay? Italy is at 68 or something. China is now tied with Greece, which is electoral democracy. And in fact, if you look at all the countries that are ranked below China, the 100 countries also that are ranked below China, more than half of them are electoral democracies. So if elections didn't fix corruption for those countries, you know, what is there a case that? So I don't think corruption, level of corruption, is inherently linked to the political system. Number one. Number two, in fact, after the Cold War, corruption came to the forefront as a global governance issue. So a lot of people saying corruption is a problem, corruption is a problem. So all these global organizations, UN, whatever, World Bank, issue those handbooks about how to fix corruption. And the panacea is all the same. You know, have elections, have parties, have free press, independent judiciary, okay? And then all these countries adopted them. And one example I like to use, because somebody did make a big study, Professor McIntyre of National University of Australia studied Indonesia. So in the case of Indonesia, Suharto, you have Suharto, horribly corrupt, okay? And then you got rid of Suharto. They did everything those handbooks told them to do. Multi-party elections, lots of parties, elections, independent judges, independent press. And then in Professor McIntyre's word, Indonesia went from one Suharto to thousands of little Suhartos. And corruption got worse by all data counts, all data counts. Not a single study will show you today Indonesia's corruption is better than Suharto's time. Not one, okay? So, and they made an independent judiciary. And then guess what happened? All the judges got corrupt. And there's nobody to check them because they're independent, okay? So it's really a, I think we ought to be a little more critical, use our own brain a little bit, instead of just read, you know, the New York Times or something, or CNN, whatever they tell you. I mean, you got to think a little bit more, and look at the data a little bit more closely. I think. I mean, I'm not. Again, I'm not making a case here. I'm analyzing. And if you can show me data and show me facts that point to a different direction, I'll switch. I mean, I'm a student here. I'm not a politician. So.
You may have a point when it comes to the New York Times. I'm just kidding. We have 15 minutes left, so let's throw it open to the floor. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Leif Erik Easley, Ewha University and the Asan Institute. Dr. Lee, you're always productively provocative, but someone has to call you out on your Taiwan democracy remarks. I mean, I don't think the problems that you identify in Taiwan society are the result of Taiwan's democracy, however imperfect. It has much more to do with Taiwan losing its comparative advantage vis-a-vis a rising China and the pressure that a rising China puts Taiwan's democracy under. And someone's got to call you out on that. To Dr. Feulner, I wonder if you could say some words about democracy promotion, and particularly on cyber, because the first point you mentioned about individual space can be increased by the internet, but by internet controls, that individual space may be actually becoming less and less over time. And to Professor Bell, always fascinating, but when you talk about meritocracy, are you selecting on the dependent variable? By studying China at a period in history, after 30 years of the most impressive economic development in human history, are you not attributing some of China's success to some particular things in China's system which may not have external validity outside of China? Thank you very much.
Dr. Feulner, would you like to respond?
You're absolutely right in terms of transparency, the internet accessibility. Erdogan, again, going back to the Turkish case with the local elections a month ago, 3 days before the election, banned access to Facebook, Twitter, etc. Yes, I mean, it can be denied, but at the same time, the fact that it is out there and that there is accessibility to it by large numbers of people in democratic and in non-democratic systems is, to me, a great advance from when I was first involved in the political arena 45, 50 years ago. And viva more diverse views on all these different subjects, however they arise. I come back from the era, looking around, I don't see anybody else with more gray hair or less hair than I have, but when the Shah of Iran basically came down because of the technology of that era, which was cassette tapes being smuggled back into Iran, primarily from Paris and other European capitals, talking about what a different system would be like in Iran. So it's very exciting for me to be a proponent of more transparency and of more democratic systems in this era when there are so many more ways that it can reach out to real people.
Well, on this question of China and political meritocracy, and let me just frame it in this way. I mean, how distinctive is it to China? And here, I mean, I think the political culture matters, you know, that China has a long history of political meritocracy. I mean, in some sense, the last 30 years is a kind of, you know, re-establishment of the kind of imperial system where leaders were chosen by means of examinations and then performance at lower levels of government. I mean, in some sense, it's kind of drawing on that history. And there's a long history of debates among political thinkers in China about what we can call political meritocracy. What are the rights abilities that matter for leaders? What are the right virtues? How can we measure them? And how can we institutionalize a system that chooses leaders with those superior virtues? So the whole idea of political meritocracy, it resonates in China because of this prior political culture. But in a different context, I wouldn't be so keen actually on criticizing democracy. And maybe here I'm a bit different than Eric. I mean, I think if the alternative to one person, one vote is military dictatorship or authoritarian populism, I mean, I'd be cheering for one person, one vote. And if a country doesn't have a long history of political meritocracy, I'd be very careful about criticizing democracy. I mean, in the case of Egypt, I actually think, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood was bad, but not that bad, much better than what happened since they were overthrown. I mean, I would actually, you know, support democracy in that context because it doesn't have a long history of political meritocracy, and the alternative to democracy is much worse. But in the case of China, there is this history of political culture. There is this political culture that of meritocracy. And it makes sense to try and reestablish it in a way which is more suitable to modern conditions. So I don't think it's just the last 30 years that explains why political meritocracy has been relatively, you know, successful, notwithstanding the tons of flaws in China.
More questions from the floor? Stunned into silence. Eric, yeah.
Let me sort of quickly respond to your point. I want to clarify something. I certainly did not mean to state or prove a causal relation between democracy and Taiwan's troubles. Okay, I'm merely, I mean, that's impossible to prove anyway, so somebody needs to really conduct a study. I haven't. I'm merely stating a correlational fact that they've had these elections, and Taiwan has a lot of troubles. Now, I take your point. A lot of people have left Taiwan and went to mainland because of economic opportunities. But also, there are a large number of Taiwanese who have left the island because they thought that the political environment is so poisoned, in their view. Lots, in droves. I don't know, I'm not saying they're in the majority, but yes, also there are many, many who moved to the mainland because of the economic opportunities. But I mean, I guess that, you know, that's sort of my point. I mean, democracy is not even attractive enough to keep their own people from moving to a tyrannical system or authoritarian regime for money. I mean, how strong of a system is that?
Okay. You know, I have to tell you, the openness of Taiwan society, indeed the ability of Taiwan people to go and live and work in China and trade with China is a function of the democracy that we had, we've seen evolving there over the last 20 years or so. You know, but put that over. Do we have any other questions from the floor? But,
So I think one thing that we may bring into the conversation is the original concept of republicanism. Not the Republican Party, but per se, not that I have anything against it, but that it is partly a meritocracy in the sense that it's incredible focus on the excellence of a citizen, what it takes, the virtue of a citizen, that takes precedent. And in fact, the idea that the only way you actually prove worthiness of becoming a true citizen, worthy of engaging in public discourse, is that you have your own economic means to support yourself, so that you don't then turn the political public arena into where you seek economic opportunity for yourself, which is then the corruption of the two realm. So, you know, that used to be the original, in a sense, that's almost a meritocratic system, in a sense. And if you look at least the original Athenian system of it, it was all about the liberal arts and stuff that we now learn as the epitome of what it means to be an intellectual these days. So in a sense, it's a combination of meritocracy based upon this conception of human excellence, which is based upon what we now call intellectual excellence. Now, I think that used to be what we used to, it's a combination of the original conception of democracy and the original conception of republicanism. That is something that is very, very different now in terms of the democracy that is practiced. The only thing that I could sort of detect that's left of that is the Senate in the US, in the sense that it's the millionaires club. People don't have to worry about their economic well-being, the people who come to the Senate, right? So they are supposed to be then completely free of concerns about their own economic well-being to engage in the truly public thing. The only problem there then is that they come there with freedom from economic want, but then do they have the intellectual content necessary to really fully engage in what is really good for the public realm? I think the problem these days when we talk about democracy is that none of the democracies that we're talking about is in any of these pure forms. That's why some people, when we talk about reforming the democratic system, are really talking about the original form of republicanism, right? Which is maybe the French system. I don't know. There are different versions of it. But I think in whatever system we're looking for, there has to be an element of meritocracy. There has to be an element of freedom from economic want, and there has to be an element of something that has to do with people who are then free from economic want to be engaged in something that is called a public sphere, right? You can't just be escape into private interest. I mean, I think that's the fundamental contradiction from the original republicanism with liberal individualism, right? Those two are, it's another contradiction, actually, if you look at it, escape into privacy is something that the original Athenians thought was really the worst form of behavior, because if you have the means, then you're supposed to be engaged in the public realm. I think that's the sense, that's the kind of spirit that we're all searching for, and I think the idea is that whichever country that has been able to preserve that the best and somehow connect that to the political elite is the one that's the best system. And I think that's the sense in which I think, for instance, the American university system still, it's not just, you know, creativity and MIT and technological superiority, but I think the kind of discourses that they engage in, liberal education that they engage, British system too, in talking about the importance of the public realm that they constantly drum into you. I mean, that's something that I think is really important, and that's what I think is really interesting about the Chinese tradition or the Confucian tradition, because it's also the same in the sense that it's that sense of the public, or if you're the elite, you're supposed to be serving the public interest, regardless of your private interest. That is being drummed into you. And it's a matter of each system finding a way to produce elites that will completely devote themselves to that public realm while providing them with the sufficient economic base, right? And that's the hardest trick for any country to do. And that's the part that I think we're now every country is beginning to face some very serious troubles with, right? So I don't know if any system, right, at this particular juncture has that yet. But if that were to be the model, I would like to ask, you know, so Eric, do you think China is the one that really does come closest to producing that public spirited servant that will really serve the public interest the best for the foreseeable future? Do you think China has the system that is able to reproduce it? Ed, do you think the United States really actually has that system, given all the money politics that it's becoming quote unquote corrupted with? Daniel, in the middle, you choose. Okay, also.
I think China's system's evolving, so it's hard to say whether they're producing virtuous or whether they're structurally producing virtuous leaders. At the very least, they're producing capable ones. The website won't go down. I think that's very. I think it's on a reasonably good trajectory. I think overall. I mean, because the official selection process is highly competitive, so you really got to deliver. It's very difficult to. It takes 30 years to move all the way to the top. Of course, there are a few bad apples, and then there are corrupt ones. But when you do get it to the top, you are at least competent. And they need to work on corruption to make sure that's cleaned up to a reasonable extent. Then I think it will be a reasonable system in terms of meritocratic selection.
In the United States, I appreciate the subtlety of your argument, particularly, Chaebong, that it's fine for me to pull out a copy of the Constitution and revert to that. The fact is, we have come a long way away from the ideal, and citing John Stuart Mill versus where we actually are, whether it's in China or whether it's in the United States, is a very different situation that we find ourselves in. One of my primary concerns is not so much money in politics, it's vested interests more broadly understood that result in a government ratchet. Every time a new program comes into existence, no matter how many independent think tanks or government agencies come along and can describe the fact that X billion dollars is being spent on 17 different pre-kindergarten education experiments, all to no avail, because by the time the children are in 3rd grade, the advantages that they had have all disappeared, because it all goes back to intact family. There's no way you're going to get rid of those, because they all have their built-in constituents in terms of the internal political structure. So in that way, I guess the notion of finding an elite somewhere who can come along and change those kinds of things is, I guess, superficially appealing. But gosh, I hope that in our system, at least in the United States, we can come up with people with the political courage and the knowledge to look objectively and say, hey, this is a better way to do it, this one's not as good, and how do we then take care of all the citizens at different levels? Not perfect, but we don't live in a perfect world, I guess.
I mean, I agree with my friend Chebong that whether it's a democracy or a Chinese type, democratic meritocracy system, the task is how to select political elites. No matter what kind of society, any large modern society is going to have elites, and the question is how could we select ones which have ability and virtue. I mean, in the Chinese case, I agree with Eric that ability is less of a problem than virtue. Virtue here meaning that the leaders are committed to the common good, not so much to their own private interests. But I think there's ways to change it without challenging the whole system. For example, one problem now in the selection process is that too much depends on the views of superiors, and it's very easy for superiors to have biased views of the moral character of the people they're selecting. There's lots of social science studies that show that peers have a much better idea of the moral character of people. So I think if the selection process could place more emphasis on peer selection rather than depending so much on superiors, it would be a huge improvement in terms of improving the virtue of the political leaders in China. Again, in a democracy, once you have one person, one vote, you can't change it because people just become attached to it regardless of the arguments for and against it. There's deep psychological reasons. In Taiwan too, I mean, I've been to Taiwan also many times, and people are aware of the flaws of the system, but nobody in Taiwan hardly argues for replacing one person, one vote. It's something deeply psychological that once you're in a voting booth and you have this sense of empowerment, I can choose my leaders, you just can't change it. No matter how bad the system is. So we have to build on that system in a place that already implements it. And in the case of the US, I think the founding fathers, I agree that we're much more concerned with merit, or they were at least as much concerned with merit as with democratic consent. But many of the meritocratic aspects of the political system have been downgraded over the years, and the whole language of merit is no longer appropriate. There's a good book called Merit. I don't know if you saw it, and he argues it's a professor of history at Cornell. I don't remember his name. That the whole language of merit, is no longer there, but it used to be so prominent in the U.S. Again, there's this tendency towards populism and one person, one vote once things are implemented, and I think it's more of a challenge in a democratic system to think of ways of selecting leaders with ability and virtue than it is perhaps in a Chinese style political system. But I think there are ways. I mean, Nicholas Reagan, he has this think tank which in California, they're doing very fascinating projects for injecting more meritocracy in the system, especially in California where there's these huge excesses of populism. And you can do that in some ways without challenging one person, one vote.
Thank you. We're out of time, I'm afraid. This promised to be a lively panel. You didn't disappoint. Thanks for being a great panel and a great audience. Thank you.
What camp are you in?